The next panel is lessons from New Orleans. We just couldn't have a seminar on charters and choice in the 10th anniversary year of the aftermath of Katrina and not take a close look at this unprecedented experiment in school choice that is happening down in New Orleans. So we are delighted to have Danielle Dreilinger up from New Orleans to moderate this panel. She's really been in the thick of things, covering this incredibly interesting landscape, very fast evolving, so different from what it used to be. She covers New Orleans schools and state education policy for NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. Before moving to New Orleans in 2012, she covered Metro News for the Boston Globe and WGBH News, among other outlets. And she began her career as an arts writer for the Nashville Scene, WBUR, and No Depression, which I'm not quite sure what that is. Sometime later you can explain what that is. All right, so Danielle, I'm turning it over to you. Thanks.
So 10 years ago this summer, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and was absolutely devastating, as I'm sure you all know. The schools had been in very bad shape, and a bunch of people took the opportunity to make extreme and radical changes. So the state there have been 126 public schools before Katrina. The state took over about 100 of them. Some of them never reopened. Some of them they reopened as traditional schools. Some of them they closed, and then they started turning them into charters. At the same time, most of the schools left with the local Orleans Parish School Board became charters as well. So where things are now, there are 80-odd schools, and more than 60 of them are still in the hands of the Recovery School District, and they are all charters. So if you've heard of the all-charter schools in New Orleans, that's what people are talking about. It's the Recovery School District. The Orleans Parish School Board has 5 traditional schools that runs itself, and then 15 to 20 charters. It's been adding more every year. At the same time, along with the state takeover component and the charter school component, there is universal choice, school choice in New Orleans. So there are no neighborhood schools at all. There's no default school assignments. Every family has to choose a school, which is why it's been such a fascinating place to talk about what parents know and how to get information out to them. So, and there's also certainly, it has been a highly politicized and emotional landscape, especially because it is so tied in with Katrina recovery and destruction and who has the power and who gets to make the decisions. So I was thinking earlier, the kind of high temperatures that people get now when you're covering Common Core, that's the kind of high temperatures that exist in New Orleans about pretty much everything related to the schools. And I know that as a reporter, it is a very complicated landscape to cover because there's just so many ramifications that come from things like you're rebuilding the school buildings at the same time as charter schools are coming and going, and where are they going to be? So one of the things I want to focus on this hour is not just, are things working in New Orleans and how does it work, but what are the lessons that people should take away as reporters? What should policymakers be thinking? Because everybody loves to look at this and see it's this grand experiment, and it's certainly fascinating on its own terms, but I think the question is really open about how the rest of the country ought to interpret it for themselves. So, looking at our really excellent panel here today from the far end of the table, Kira Orange-Jones is the New Orleans representative on the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. She is also the director for the New Orleans chapter of Teach for America. Doug Harris has been introduced in the previous panel, but he's the director of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans at Tulane. Sarah Carr is a previous Times-Picayune longtime education reporter who has written extensively about New Orleans education and now leads a project at Columbia. And Aesha Rasheed runs the New Orleans Parents Guide, which is an information source for parents. She also co-founded a charter school and covered education before Katrina. So actually, just for a little last bit of historical context, Aesha, I want to start with you just to tell us what the school system was like before the storm.
Right. Thanks, Danielle. So, as you mentioned, I covered public education in New Orleans at the Times-Picayune for 5 years prior to Katrina. So my time covering public education in New Orleans was a period of time of great tumult, and the time in which the school board seated the last superintendent to run the unified school district before the storm happened, when there was really intense political context in which there were conversations about corruption, massive financial challenges, the district not actually knowing enough about its finances, significant numbers of schools that were in pretty bad disrepair. Like, I remember going into school buildings often and talking to administrators who, were like, this building is half unusable because of the leaks and because of the deferred maintenance and because of these huge problems. A thing that I think is also important contextually to understand, and Doug mentioned this earlier, a significant portion of school-age children in New Orleans were not attending public schools. There was a significant portion, I think you said 30%, somewhere between 30 and 40% before Katrina, of families were sending their children to non-public schools, both because of legacy, because of a dissatisfaction with the public school community, because of race, because of the legacy of failed desegregation, right? So these were all the contextual realities, and a real lack of faith in the public education system was part of what was building up and setting the stage for these decisions that began really in 2003, when we created the Recovery School District as an incubation, kind of like a neonatal unit for schools that were massively failing. And then, as Danielle kind of talked about already, that mechanism was used to expand dramatically at the point of Katrina. So those are some of the things that I think are important to understand about the historical context of what was happening right before the flooding and devastation. And I think another important point just about physicality, as Danielle said, there were about 126 to 128 public schools. It's funny that we don't know a number, because even back then we did not know a number of schools that were open prior to Katrina, but most of them were under-enrolled. So there was a lot of conversation about right-sizing the district and a lot of tension about that. People didn't want the school in their neighborhood closed, but also the district was saying we can't keep all of these buildings open. So actually the number of school buildings that we have open and functioning as schools now is probably close to what we needed then. So we had 128 school buildings, but not necessarily enough kids for 128 schools to be functioning and open and operating at a level that could provide the resources. The schools were big enough to really serve those students well.
So just to ask the big question first, and hopefully not take the entire hour, even though we could talk about this for hours and usually do, are the students better off now, 10 years out? And if so, or if not, what are the reasons to believe that this enormous reinvention played a key role in the improvement? Start at the end with Kira.
I would begin by just saying, I think on most quantitative metrics, the answer is yes. I'll share a personal anecdote first, and as Aesha is speaking, I'm reminded, I've been working as an educator in Louisiana almost 15 years now, and I remember being in my sort of second or third year teaching and thinking about schools across Louisiana that would provide powerful examples to my then fourth grade students of sort of what could happen beyond high school. So sort of the idea of college or career, and inspiring my kids, and of course and also working with their families to think about options, and casting a very wide net about where we should go look to see what high schools were actually putting kids on a dramatically different path in life, and working with my principal really closely, and actually coming up, and this was of course over a decade ago, but coming up very shorthanded for examples, and particularly examples in New Orleans that we're actually working with students who share the demographics of the students that we work with, who are actually putting kids on a radically different path. In fact, at that point, we could not point to one school that we could actually send a group of parents to go visit. So that's my own personal observation when I think about the last 10 years. When we look at just the quantitative data, what we're looking at is, think about 2005, I want to say about 70% of schools were considered academically failing by state accountability standards. That number shifted pretty significantly to about 7% today. And the overall amount of students who are scoring proficient on, standard, our basic state test has actually increased from is about 70% now, up from about, 25% in 2005. So I think on a quantitative level, there have been significant improvements for students across the city.
So I said earlier in the prior panel, and I'll kind of reiterate and explain now why I'm less sure. I think certainly when the stories that you hear about what was going on before Katrina are pretty horrible. On the other hand, having studied school reform for a long time, we've also seen lots of situations where it looks like things are a lot better in terms of test scores. And then, at least in terms of the high stakes testing, and then when we look at the lower stakes tests, so we compare, say, the NAEP to the state tests, and this came up with the election in 2000 with the Texas Miracle when George W. Bush was running, that you compare these two trends, and the state scores were shooting up, and the NAEP scores were flat in Texas, and there are lots of different reasons why that can happen. So one of the things that charter schools do, which you can debate whether how good this, how positive this is to really focus on the test and to really focus on academics. And so they put a lot more time on task into math and reading, and they pay more attention to the standards, and the teaching is more aligned to those standards. And so that's going to make the scores go up. Now, some of the things that get changed to make scores go up are things that lead to long-term learning gain, and some of them are not. Right? Some of them are teaching to the test and drilling the test and things like that. So both of those things are definitely going on, and I think the question remains how much of what's going on is genuine better instruction, which is really what we want, and how much of it is these other things. And so we're doing a bunch of studies trying to tease that out. The other issue is that you have a lot of other things that changed when the reforms went. It wasn't just that Katrina brought school reform, right? Katrina brought a lot of things. It brought devastation to the city. Everybody left. Some people came back. Some people didn't come back. The housing projects were shut down, so we have a possibly different kind of population that might have higher achievement, separate from anything that the schools may have done. On the other hand, so those are all things that would be making things look better than they really are. On the other hand, you also had this huge disruption, right? So a lot of the students did come back and went back into the schools, and yet they literally went through hell, right? They lost family members, they lost their houses, they lost their friends, they lost their neighborhoods, and then came back and tried to pick up the pieces. So the schools are then trying to overcome that at the same time. So it could be that we're actually understating the effects. So we're doing a bunch of studies right now trying to figure that out. We're presenting all this at a conference in June 18th to the 20th in New Orleans. If anybody's interested in coming to see that. I don't have a lot of conclusions to present at this point, because we're still working on these, but those are the kinds of issues I think we need to look at. Ultimately, we want to look at the college outcomes, because I think that's really the best indication of how any school system is, or how any school reform is working, is to look at those longer term outcomes. And those are a lot harder to game, right? It's a lot harder to make college graduation look good in ways that don't reflect real improvement and future life outcomes for students. I think, and because we think college is such a strong predictor of life outcomes, that's really the key outcome. And in that one, it's going to be a while. Like we just have to wait longer in New Orleans to know whether we're seeing those effects. Because if you just think about it, you would want to study students who have been at least all the way through high school, 9th grade through 12th grade, and had 4 or 5 years to finish college. Well, that's 9 years, and we're only 10 years out. So I think that just not enough time has passed to draw those bigger conclusions. So in the short term, we'll look at the test scores and see what we can tease out from that. And certainly the trends are positive. Everything Kira said is right. When you look at it at face value, everything is shot up. But we also know from history that not all of that is probably real.
Yeah, no, my thoughts are somewhat similar to Doug's, in that, when I was a reporter working for the Times-Picayune and would do the regular stories about their test scores seeming to trend up, I'd hear from people and I'm sure Danielle gets this all the time, from people who just wanted banner headlines every day about how the test scores were going up and how great this was, and people on the other hand who would be like, why aren't you looking more into cheating? Why don't you point out in the lead of every story about this that some of the most vulnerable kids never came back to the city, and that the schools were spending more per pupil right afterwards? And I became kind of frustrated with this sort of constant back and forth about sort of exactly how much of the test score growth is legitimate or not. And I felt like it distracted from what could be an even more significant issue of, do we want sort of schools that are so driven and pressured to demonstrate short-term test score growth? And so I felt like the way we were kind of framing the issue and the question was even a little bit distorted. And as one example, there was a pretty high-performing charter school that I spent a lot of time at when I was reporting my book, where they realized that not enough of their sophomores or their juniors, I can't remember which level, were on pace to pass the state standardized tests in social studies and science, and so they temporarily dropped all other subjects for most of their day and triple dosed them in social studies and science. And it was something they really felt like they had to do, and maybe they did. But I think that decision wasn't designed to sort of get kids as prepared for college as they could be. It was designed to pass and do well on the state standardized tests. Just one other thought is, I think it's incredibly important to sort of keep in mind history and to not forget sort of where the schools came from. But I also, particularly with the 10th anniversary coming up, just feel like there needs to be an emphasis on sort of thinking of the schools of where they need to be and not always just comparing them to the past.
Yeah, I think I would just echo what other folks have said, especially Sarah, and add that I increasingly am not interested in the question. Because I think I actually want to know what kids need and what do we as communities need in New Orleans. In another life, I'm a massage therapist, and when my clients come to me, I want to know if they overall are feeling better from when they started, but I also want to know what they need now, which could be really different than what they needed when they started coming to me 5 years ago. So I just think that we spend a lot of energy trying to measure this, like, is it better, is it worse? And I think it distracts from the question of what do our families and communities and children need today, which they're different than they were 10 years ago, so.
Great. So part of this experiment that has been very influential was the state takeover school district. And of course, Louisiana was not the first to come up with this, but it's certainly been the most prominent. So I know I have people calling me, and I'm sure you guys also have people calling you saying, oh, hey, Georgia's governor is talking about doing a recovery school district model. Tennessee has done one. And we want to come to New Orleans and see what it's like, because some people say it's great and some people say it's terrible. And I always, at that point, get stuck in thinking, it's not, I don't know how useful that is when you look at New Orleans, because the state took over so many schools all at once, and that's just so different than what's happening in Memphis. So my question now is, like, what lessons do you guys think people should take away from the recovery school district? Like, what does RSD in New Orleans have to teach other people, especially now that it's 10 years almost since it really got going?
Well, just one observation, and this goes back again to one of the earlier panels on the authorization process. So one thing that's really different about New Orleans is that they really do close schools, and they really do close them based on test scores. I don't think there's any city that's even close to the level of accountability. This is one reason why when we think about the test scores, that you have to be initially worried about things, that there's so much pressure to get higher scores. But that pressure is there because you can be shut down, and there's a good chance you'll be shut down if you don't. So I think that's something that's quite different from other places. And I'm not sure that there's as much of an appetite. I mean, there has to be a political appetite. If that's, and I'm not, not judging whether this is a good system or not, but if that's what we think, and I know a lot of the people in New Orleans think that that's what's going to drive improvement ultimately, is that shutting down of low-performing schools, and I think that was part of the message from the earlier panel too. If that's the thing that's going to make it work, there has to be a political will that I think people might not recognize behind that, because it takes a lot of guts to do that, and a lot of pressure.
I would build on that and say I think it begins with, I think there are several takeaways, but to Doug's point about renewals, there's of course the piece of this, it's just simply about approvals. And if we looked at even the first year where charters were sort of implemented across the city of New Orleans, 6 out of 44 charter applications were approved that year. So the tremendously high standard that was used to actually determine the extent to which a school was actually ready to begin was incredibly high. And then to Doug's point about the kind of political pressure and that exists to close a school or not close a school is very real. I feel that as an elected official myself, and being able to be held accountable to the accountability standards that are true across our state, true across our city, and believe that schools that don't meet that standard after a set period of time have to be held accountable for those outcomes has been a very real part of it. But I'd add a couple more elements that I think are important takeaways. The next being around school autonomy. I think this is a really important lesson, just the fact that what we have is building level leaders who feel fully accountable and freed up to actually make building level decisions that they actually think are in the best interest of their school community, of their students. And overwhelmingly, I hear from leaders across our city that has actually been one of the key tenets that have led to the increased ownership in a sense, and the increased progress that they actually have been able to drive towards in their school buildings. And finally, I'll just add a third, which I think is the ability to sort of to course adjust nimbly. I think about, for example, in New Orleans, the one app enrollment system that we now have that is centrally, a process that is run centrally, that the Recovery School District oversees, that enables parents and families across the city of New Orleans to actually rank what schools they want to send their children to, which was really in response to recognizing that in a system of autonomy that exists across our city, there are places where it could create a lot of inequity in terms of where parents and students are ultimately enabled to attend, schools they're able to attend. So the idea that you can actually look at the system, be grounded in what's happening, and adjust nimbly has been a very real part of what I think has led to the growth over time across the city.
Yeah, I think the autonomy thing I think is important and requires some more elaboration, which is that it's not just a state takeover, right? Because we've had state takeovers before. We've done that for 20 years, actually. What's different here is that, and what happened in the Recovery School District was they initially did take them over in the sense that they were running them. Then they didn't want to run them, right? Then they were trying to find the charter school operators to come in and actually be the ones running it, and then give them the autonomy and have the accountability attached to that. So, and they didn't want to be running them, and I think most people would say that when they were running them, it wasn't all that successful, that they needed somebody else to come in and do that. So it's not just a state takeover per se, that there's a lot more to it than that.
I think a lot of times people kind of focus a little bit too much on the governance and process issues, which aren't unimportant and are definitely worth kind of understanding and taking into account, but that some of the ways that what happened in New Orleans might be most relevant and interesting, particularly to education reporters in other cities, is just sort of the kinds of changes that the governance and process issues sort of laid the groundwork for. And just that what's happened in New Orleans speaks to kind of a lot of big questions and debates that are really reshaping urban education across the country, no matter sort of what the governance shifts were that precipitated it. And just like a couple of those are, there was a big change in teacher demographics after Hurricane Katrina because all of the teachers were unilaterally fired. So just to what extent do teacher demographics and cultural connection and racial connection matter in a teaching corps? To what extent, thinking of school closures, does stability and consistency matter or not? Like how do you weigh what sort of other panels have touched on, the sort of the importance of setting a high bar and not letting failing schools kind of stay open too long, with this need to make sure that families and students can develop long-term relationships with institutions that they come to trust. What is sort of, as Doug was talking about, kind of the promise and peril of this kind of age of big data in schools and just institutions where just every decision is so based on this need to demonstrate short-term test score growth. And just also, I actually think when it comes to school choice, a lot of people had sort of given up before a lot of the New Orleans experiment happened with the idea that that school choice alone would drive quality, but there is still a lot of concern and discussion and debate there about how do we, as much as possible, help it to improve equity. So, some thoughts.
I think that I would add that New Orleans, something that's, so I don't think that New Orleans is a replicable experience, and I think it's important for people to keep that in mind. It's such a specific set of circumstances and such a unique and traumatic and kind of horrific set of circumstances that it's just not worth trying to figure out if you could exactly do it again. But I think things that I observe as learnings from the experience is it's really important to, I think that part of the promise of charter is this idea of people having autonomy to innovate and look at new ways of thinking about how we nurture and educate children. I think New Orleans didn't actually feed that early on. I think that what the result of that is that we have a lot of schools that are very similar in their approach. And maybe that's right, maybe those approaches are the only ones that work, but we're only just now starting to see actual divergent approaches. And I think that we could have been seeing that sooner had we been feeding that kind of thinking instead of sort of creating a template that a lot of folks are following. I think also something that New Orleans learned is that there isn't a rush of people who are ready to sign up for the job of running schools to serve kids who have high needs. Like it took a lot of work in New Orleans to find people who were willing and then support them. And I think that was really critical work in the early years. And I think that is part of how we ended up with the Art Recovery School District running so many schools when they never really wanted to, because it just took time to find people who were ready, and that time is important. I think, so the closure, school assignment, where schools are gonna be, community engagement questions, I just remember in my own thinking that, you need to take the politics out of these decisions. This is something that I remember saying and thinking, especially as a reporter and like talking to leaders, superintendent level and BESI members about that. And I think now I'm kind of come to a place to say that politics and relationships matter and they're hard to tease apart. Right, when a community says we want X for our school and they use the channels that they have, the relationships that they have, the political capital that they have to try to get that, that's not necessarily bad, right? And I think we have to be thoughtful about just ignoring something that feels like political pressure to come to an understanding. I think New Orleans made a lot of closure decision process mistakes, even if the actual closing of some of those schools was the right decision because they weren't serving kids, the process was really hurtful to families, I think, in some of those early decisions. And I think there's been growth around how to do a closure well, but we're still not there. And I think that that's something to look at if you're talking about increasing charter and choice kind of mechanisms in other communities.
I just want to add one. I just thinking about the whole issue of sort of relationships and community mattering to some extent. I also think we need to sort of rethink what we're thinking about and talking about when we say community, because in New Orleans and elsewhere, I find it's just often sort of this code word for, have you sort of brought together an anti-charter elite with a pro-charter elite and let them both sort of sit at a table and hear about this change, but not really enough venues and ways to engage the people who are going to be most impacted by the changes, who often all have the most complicated and nuanced views on them as well.
So I come back to this question of whether it's replicable. So I think I take a very long time horizon on these kinds of things. So the system we have in place now in most places didn't exist 50 to 75 years ago either. So the system of having a school district and having a school board and having a superintendent, that was new back in the day. And so and over time, everybody adopted that system. So that's how we ended up here. So I think taking a longer view of it, I think it is replicable. Certainly in the short term, different pieces of it are replicable. And I think the question is how an individual piece might work without the other pieces, right? So that's what's going on in Georgia, and if they did take over the schools, if you did just that, but you didn't change, if you didn't create a new pipeline of teachers, if you didn't make the investment of creating incubators to bring in more charter management organizations that really were interested in creating new schools there for the long haul, if you didn't do all those other things, if you just did that one thing, would that have an effect? So I think we're going to learn a lot from New Orleans about how these pieces fit together and what might happen in the short term anyway, when as some districts might try to go gradually towards that kind of a system.
I would just maybe connect the first question you raised, Danielle, with the second, and say that I think the reason the results matter is not to overly simplify the complex set of experiences our children or families experience every day, or to, Sarah and Aesha, your point, which I agree with, that quantitative measures are not the only measures that we should be looking at to actually assess the overall experience of a child's learning. It matters because when you look at the story of results in New Orleans, and you compare those against the state, and you see the relative sort of rapid pace of change across the city, I think it actually begs the question, what's happening? Like, what is actually working? And that's actually a really important question, which ties to your second question, what then can actually be extrapolated and applied to other settings? Not to say that there aren't, of course, several things that we could also extrapolate that are actually, room for adjustment, but it is a missed opportunity. You think about going from 70 or whatever it is, 65% or 70% of failing schools to 7% of schools. Or you look at the fact that New Orleans literally went from like the bottom, I believe it was 68th of 69 or 69 of 69 school district ratings in the state, to where it is now, increasing every single year, I believe now over, I want to say it's at 40 of 69 today. That may be as of last year. And you have to sort of ask yourself, what is happening? And I think lots of what we've discussed are the elements that actually lead us to be able to figure out what can we learn and create a more sort of cohesive, sort of productive learning culture around what we can learn from elements of what's led to the success so far.
So I'm going to say one thing that I think people should take away, and then we'll open it up to questions from you guys. I think for reporters, when you're looking at any state that's playing any sort of takeover district, I think you need to look at what's the exit plan, because there was not one. There has not been one in New Orleans, and it's been it's had an unexpectedly long chain of ramifications and debates now. It's up to individual recovery school district charter schools. Once they've met certain academic requirements, they decide whether or not they want to go back. There's nothing in the law or the policy that says, okay, at some point these schools have recovered and are returned. And there's a real impact when you have a long-term way to run schools in a city that's just not how we do it in the US, and that's not democratic. There are people making a lot of decisions, and they can and are often pressured to take community input into account, but they don't have to. And that's what I've spent most of my time covering recently, is this discussion of, okay, now what next? Is the state going to be authorizing these charter schools in New Orleans forever? And it's something that I know Tennessee purposely put some clauses in its legislation that wouldn't have to deal with this question. So this is something I really wonder, if the rest of the country is doing something differently, having looked at the New Orleans experience.
Hi, I'm Alia Malik. I'm a reporter with the San Antonio Express News. What lessons do you think New Orleans has for cities that might not have a large proportion of charters, but in which the charter sector is growing fast, and that are never really going to go to a model like New Orleans, obviously?
So I think that my work is primarily in providing information to parents to navigate their choices and options and understand what the schools are offering. I brought a few copies of the Parents Guide if anybody wants to flip through them. But I think that New Orleans has a lesson about that it's important for families. Why shouldn't families know more about the schools where their kids are going? Whether or not they're making what we call choices, like filling out a form or choosing a charter, like they're still engaging with this school. And as earlier speaker spoke to, people are making choices in a lot of ways, like sometimes in sort of a black market, lying about their address kind of way, and sometimes in a like purchasing a different house or living doubled up in a different place. Like people actually are making these decisions, and so we should provide information to help them understand what's happening in schools in a massive way. And I think I'm proud of the work that we have done, where we don't say, here's information about charter schools because they're the ones you can choose, where we say, like, here's information about schools, all of them, in one place so that you can look at them in general, and whether you're making a school choice right now or just want to understand what's happening, what programming, what kind of realities are happening for kids in that school community, you get that information and that access. And the other thing I think is that New Orleans has come a long way with one app, but we still have two systems of application. So we have one that is for the schools that are completely open access, and has grown to include all but 9 schools. It's like complicated to explain because the 9 schools that aren't included, it's like there are caveats and asterisks all over the place. You need one system. And I think that equity can't happen in New Orleans fully until we have like one system that people use to figure out where their children would go to school. And I think that would be true even in a place where you have neighborhood and charter schools that are using different, that your way of enrolling is slightly different. Like there should be kind of one entry point for families.
So just one other response. I'm not sure I'd be so sure that it's not going to end up looking like New Orleans in the long term, right? So you just said charter schools are growing really quickly. And I think a lot of what's going to happen is not going to happen with the same process as it happened in New Orleans. That doesn't mean it's not going to end up at a somewhat similar place. And again, taking a long time horizon here, if they keep growing at 5 or 10% a year, eventually that becomes a big number that looks a lot like New Orleans.
Yeah, and I think even if it did stay like a relatively small percentage of the landscape charters, that a lot of the tensions that kind of define and take over the debate in New Orleans are present in cities where charters represent a much smaller part of the sector. This sort of question of who should be running schools and how, and who should be working with them, and the debate about sort of homegrown versus outsider charter chains and choice versus neighborhood schools, and sort of do we want a more democratic or a more technocratic approach to running schools are present in dozens of cities across the country.
So another way to think about this is that it's an upper bound on what's possible, right? So New Orleans did everything, and they did it all at once, and very intensively, far more than anybody's ever tried it before. So this is proof of concept, whether something like this can work. And I think, as Sarah's saying, that's why it's feeding the conversation. That's why so many people are talking about it. Like, should we go in this direction? Again, they're not going to go in that direction the way we went about it in New Orleans and as quickly as it did. But it doesn't mean that the messages that are coming out of that and the lessons aren't going to have a big impact.
So folks were making some comments about how selective New Orleans was about
I'm sorry, would
approving-
you remember to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Patrick O'Donnell, Cleveland Plain Dealer. There was discussion earlier about how selective New Orleans was about approving new charter schools and about how quick you were to shut down ones that were not performing. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about what the numbers were for that, or good resources to look that up, and then what kind of standards were there? Were they much different from other states, or how did those come about?
You can take it off.
Is Alex still here? Actually, Alex was pretty involved in this from NACS, though, was with the organization involved in, he left, okay. So we have a study coming out on that at the conference. I don't have the specific numbers. I don't know if anybody else has better numbers.
Well, I've sent you guys the list that I've been working on, that you guys are also working on, of just trying to figure out which schools have been open which years since Katrina. That list doesn't exist. You no, because in some case, but whether they exist as like a charter or
Yeah,
which
no,
grades.
over the
You
years.
do have
yeah.
that? Let's
It's on my computer. Yeah, so I do think that the NACSA, in the early years, in my recollection, and Kira can probably speak to this more definitively from her role, Bessie, I think, really moved strategically around following NACSA's recommendations, and I think set up a scenario in which it was not politically supported to break from those recommendations. And I think that was really important, because they were really trying to say, like, we are bringing this outside advisor group to look at these applications. I think that was a really important filtering process in the beginning, and as Kira mentioned, a lot of applications were not approved in the early years, even though there was a lot of pressure to open a lot of schools. I mean, this is in a context in which people were desperately trying to come home, trying to figure out what did that mean for kids. I remember being in the city in late 2005 and how hard it was to walk around and not hear children laughing and crying and running and playing. Like, it breaks your heart. So against that, we had to open a lot of schools, and I think that Bessie really held a line about not being willing to allow schools that didn't seem like they were going to be able to be effective to open. And I mean, some of it was about track record. Did you have some experiences elsewhere? Really proving some. And I think there were some parts of it that were about having some engagement with community, which I applaud that was part of that metric. I don't think it was deep enough, and I think that has gotten deeper over the years, that you are not you can prove that you have some relationships to the community where you would like to operate a school.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I would add, as a representative of New Orleans on a state board responsible for the renewal process as well, and thinking about, what it means for a school community, in particular the educators within a school community, to come forward and make the case to the board about the progress that's been made over the last however many years, that they've certainly no doubt been working extraordinarily hard to create the kind of learning environment in their building that we believe would be conducive to student learning, and looking at their results over the last several years and not seeing that growth. If the standard is that we will actually move our students from schools that have been F schools to schools that are on a different academic track and no longer failing, and a school hasn't actually been able to demonstrate that, it is really challenging to be able to say to the school community, despite your efforts and the deep respect we have for you as educators, myself being an educator personally, we are going to hold the line. And the calls you get, and the politics of it all. I mean, it is actually extraordinarily difficult to actually hold that line, and I've experienced that more than once. And yet, consistently as a board, we've felt that we must, simply because we feel as though the autonomy that is afforded in the model that we've created, the other side of that is clear accountability. And we have a responsibility as educators to actually hold ourselves accountable for the experiences of our students. So there's been, those are hard decisions, and yet consistently that has been the line that we have consistently held on every example over the last 3 years, certainly, that I've been on the board.
Yeah, just to echo that, the vast majority of the applications have been rejected. So I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. So it's not like they clearly weren't just taking anybody who came in the door. They were rejecting almost all of them.
Jeff Hennig, who is at Teachers College, wrote a book on portfolio approaches to running schools, where there's this idea of sort of constant change built in, and this Darwinian notion that sort of strong schools will perpetually be taking over the weaker ones. And one point that he made that I think is really important to keep in context in thinking about New Orleans moving forward is just that over time, a lot of sort of the nonprofit charter networks and school operators that emerged that are supposed to be sort of replacing the old school system bureaucracy can in some ways become just as political and bureaucratic and sort of embedded it as the old system they displaced. And so I think it will be fascinating to watch moving forward there, because I'm sure inevitably there will be sort of more and more very politically popular and connected charter operators in New Orleans, who a lot of people have invested a lot of time and money in, whose schools aren't making that bar.
Sure. I'm Doug Livingston, Akron Beacon Journal. You mentioned that a lot of the applications have been rejected. And I just want to know if you can give us some of the reasons why those applications didn't look worthy of getting your stamp of approval from the state's perspective, or from some of the folks who have covered maybe some of the flops, and kind of the upfront accountability portion of this.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, go in there.
Well, I mean, I think one thing there was a fairly conscious decision not to favor the for-profits. So Michigan, for example, Michigan and New Orleans are quite different in that respect. There was, I think, in the entire 10-year period in New Orleans, I think there was only one school that had a for-profit CMO. So that seemed to be a mark against. And I think there was also they were favoring schools that had some sort of community connection. They were partnering with some sort of local organization. As Kira said, favoring schools that had some sort of a track record, although that was hard because that meant having somebody outside of New Orleans, because there weren't a lot of schools. There were 4 charters in New Orleans before Katrina, so there's a little bit of a base to start with, and some of those CMOs have remained and grown since then. But I think these were 100-page applications, so I think there was a lot that went into it, and they had these secret peer review panels that NACSA had organized, and so I think it's hard to boil it down, but I think those are the things that we've seen so far. And again, we'll have a study that documents more clearly what those things are at the June conference.
I think the financial model ideals were also important in that. So I'm speaking now both as somebody who. The NACSA reviewers were often some of them were people from New Orleans, right? So hearing some of that feedback, and then also the process that the community that I'm a part of that started a charter school went through. There's a significant look at your model for whether or not you're going to be able to do the things that you say you're going to do based on the money that you would have. So that's significant, right? Like, do you have a reasonable financial model? And then pretty high bars around, are you committed to equity? Like, are you committed to serving kids of need? So I think, if you didn't have, for example, reasonable amounts of special education supports built into the application that you're submitting, then it begs the question of are you intending to not serve special needs kids? And so that might be a question that comes back, right, in that conversation. There's an interview process that happened, at least then. I don't know exactly what's happening now, but where a cross-section, the person who's the school leader, people who are a part of the board, if you have community supporters, sat with the interviewers and reviewed questions around equity, access, finances, and these sorts of things. So a mix of those things, and I think some of those applications probably fell short on a number of those parts,
I think also that there has been a focus on the kind of applications and training and pipelines that the educrats respect and understand. Mm-hmm. There have been many applications from community groups and community educators that were rejected, and it's not been clear to which they were not able to make the case that they were going to be able to run a good school. The Charter School Association has started a workshop to help people write applications, because the concern has been that either reviewers were actively prejudiced against homegrown groups starting schools, or if they were somehow not qualified by their standards, or if they were not able to demonstrate that they were qualified. But it's certainly been very, very clear that a lot of applications from those groups have not made it through.
Yeah.
Was there a public forum where they explained these sorts of things?
My being on the board, but go ahead.
Yeah. So at the point in time when Bessie is considering applications, then each application, does this have the NACSA review boards thumbs up, thumbs down, and then Bessie votes. So it's possible for the state school board to say, thank you for your recommendation, NACSA, we're gonna go another way. But generally speaking, that didn't happen. And I'm not sure if that has happened ever. I think there has been one time, yeah. So that part is public, right? But the actual reviewing process is not. I think something else that's important to speak to is in the early years, an organization called New Schools for New Orleans was doing a lot of incubating of people who wanted to eventually start charter schools, which meant that they had folks who got into that pipeline, which was something you had to apply for, and a grant, had like a year of support, which means you had the time and the pay and the money to be able to incubate your idea. For a lot of community-based organizations, which I don't want to argue that none of the folks who were going through that pipeline had community ties, because that's not necessarily true, but they tended to be folks who were kind of like educators sort of recruited into New Orleans folks. And then there were other folks, and for myself, as a community group, like a group of us in our neighborhood decided we wanted to start a charter school, and we knew we needed a year or two to think about it. And everybody who was involved, we didn't have that kind of grant dollars to support us hiring somebody ahead of time, right? So it's just like it's a lot of work writing this application and thinking about your plans and your pedagogy and all of that stuff. And for a lot of community organizations that were interested in getting involved in this, they may not have had the capacity for it. So I think what the Charter School Association is now doing is trying to build some capacity to feed folks who have good ideas but maybe just don't have the time to like quit their jobs and spend all of their time recruiting teachers and thinking about their philosophies. And I think we were kind of an interesting, unusual set of people who were crazy enough and whatever that we did figure out how to make this time commitment, but that I think really did shape, and it brought some critique that people were like, well, you're only going to pick the folks who kind of had these elite ties. But I think it is reasonable to say that you want people who have given a lot of thought to how they're going to run a school, running a school, like who have had the time to do that. So I don't want just somebody who's just a nice person who loves kids, right? Like you also have to be thinking about how you're going to serve kids.